Hola amigos, el video que a continuación les tengo es a partir de un pastor, un autor y un conferencista llamado Tommy Ice, el cual lleva mucho tiempo analizando la profecía bíblica. De hecho ya he subido 2 que 3 videos de este gran autor de la conspiración también. Y bueno, pero los dejo con Tommy Ice y su excelente video que es nuevo en Prophecy Watchers. Saludos a todos y muchas gracias por el apoyo a los patrocinadores. Espero que más personas me sigan en la red social de Patreon, en los cuales tenemos contenido extra. Que pasen una excelente tarde. Tommy Ice.
When we talk about premillennial, what's that mean?
Well, premillennialism is people that believe that Revelation 19 is when Jesus comes back, and he comes all the way down to planet Earth. Just like he prophesied in Acts 1, he'll return in the same way as he left. And then the 1,000-year reign of Christ, where he reigns and rules from Jerusalem, occurs.
A physical, literal, real
And that's
kingdom.
called the millennium, or the 1,000 years. That's the Latin. It's chiliasm, if you go with the Greek, is another term for it. And there has developed in history really amillennialism, which you had before that, you had anti-millennialism. You had people like those in Alexandria, Egypt, who were simply opposed to premillennialism because of their philosophy of, the millennium couldn't be a carnal thing that involved the flesh.
Kind of a Gnostic.
Exactly. And so that then became an official view with people like Augustine in the early 400s, where they taught something called amillennialism, which they taught that, and this is after 313, where Constantine Christianized the Roman Empire, you see. And so they taught that the current age is the millennium. That's historic amillennialism, that we're in the millennium now. And I always like to say, if this is a millennium, then I must be in the ghetto side, but there is no ghetto in the millennium, And the fact of the matter is, then you had even early on some people that were more optimistic, and that eventually, especially by the time of the Reformation, morphed into what we call postmillennialism. So postmillennialism is pretty much the idea of, it's very similar in many ways to amillennialism, but it says that God is going to eventually convert all the people before he returns.
Through the church.
Through the church and through the preaching of the gospel. And so both amillennialism and postmillennialism have no future for Israel. I was the co-author of a book in 1988 called Dominion Theology, Blessing or Curse, an analysis of the Christian Reconstruction movement. And, I pointed out in that book that there's not a single passage that teaches postmillennialism or even amillennialism. Those are things that are derived based on secondary reasoning. Whereas we, as premillennialists, can go and say, well, Revelation 19 happens where Jesus returns, and you see this sequence of 7 and I saws, which are one thing after another. It's chronological, I believe. And then you have the millennium in chapter 20 being talked about 6 times. And so that is why the early church was premillennialist, because Christ returns and then you have the millennium. Whereas there's no passage that lays out either amillennialism or postmillennialism. And so they have to use all kinds of, in my opinion, invalid reasoning and philosophical thought and all of this kind of stuff to try to make their case. This whole idea that the pre-trib rapture is new, and I think our movement is a Bible movement. Its whole emphasis is on teaching the Bible. And everybody admits that about dispensations. They are biblically oriented people. Now, obviously, many people disagree with us, but they all admit we love the Bible, we teach the Bible, we study the Bible. And I think it took, for example, in the 1950s, within our movement, there were hardly any guys that had PhDs, that had studied church history. And there were some, but not many. And I think it just took a while for the movement to mature enough to where we started studying, had guys in our movement that start studying in depth church history. And so now, especially because of that challenge, you've had trained people like Bill Watson, a PhD from University of California, and he was a specialist in the 1600s and 1700s, European history.
Yeah, English literature, history,
Yes,
theology.
exactly. And he had a seminary degree from Talbot Seminary. And he had a debate on his campus at Colorado Christian with somebody on this issue like 12 years ago, and that got him interested into all of this, and he spent his summers going over to England and tracking all this stuff down. And then comes the internet where you can do that at home now. You can study, do researches and all this kind of stuff.
And we don't have all the information, and as the technology is allowing us, more research is being done. You can put in search terms in the Greek and the Old Latin and all of it. So this is a minimum, which is really just scratching the surface of providing a body of evidence showing that the idea of a pre-tribulation rapture, a 7-year, tribulation, is not new.
Right. And that answers probably the number one criticism of pre-tribulationism. That, well, if pre-tribulationism is taught in the Bible, how come nobody saw it before dark?
Yeah, how come nobody talked about it?
That is basically the argument. Well, we're finding out there were a lot of people. But you had 1,200 years when the Roman Catholic Church banned premillennialism. And so it begins to die off by the 400s, you see. So if you're not premillennial, you're not going to be pre-trib. You see, pre-tribulationism is a sub-development within premillennialism.
As you watch this, you think, how is this a prophecy update? Well, let me tell you why. Because when we think about prophecy updates, we're looking around, we're watching the current events, we're watching the way that the world is shifting, and we're looking at it through really a biblical lens and a theological lens. And so one of the things that I really wanted to do was to show, especially since Tommy was here, was this accusation comes out, and ultimately the accusation is meant to tell us that when we look out at the world and we're trying to understand the current prophetic events, it's a waste of time. And so we want to say, no, it is not a waste of time. Not only is it biblical, but what we're shown today, and we just barely were able to get to the glimpse of it, was that it's historical and it's theologically accurate. And so when people come and try to dissuade you from exploring these things, and they're throwing these accusations, you say, well, hey, have you not heard or have you not read truly? So, let's close it out here. But if you have any, really follow-up comments to that, what do you say to the audience of those that are really getting torn between friends and family and the confusion?
Well, what really developed in the early 1800s was the realization that Israel meant Israel. Mm-hmm. And even in the 1600s and 1700s, those who were premillennial, they still saw that as a phase of the church. You see what I'm saying? So once Israel began to be seen as Israel, you have the rise of dispensationalism, you see, which sees as one of Ryrie's sine qua nons, it's a distinction between God's plan for Israel and the church. And so that really hasn't been developed fully until the early 1800s as they begin to develop it. And now it's fully developed. You see, I just don't see any further development really going because unless there's a paradigm shift and you go in a different direction.
Yeah. I suppose if Israel was nuked and was gone and they were scattered and they never existed, that would be really interesting. I think it would be like, wow, but we're not dealing with hypotheticals.
No.
We're dealing with facts.
And God says it's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen.
God has all of these focuses on Israel and the fact that they have their 70th week left. Mm-hmm. And that's why he's bringing them back into the land. Now, I graduated from high school in 1969, and I thought, I got married in December 1972, and I was like, I hope the rapture doesn't come before we get married, and those kinds of things. I'm sure many of the viewers have experienced similar things. Well, it's been 49 years later, and now we said, please, Lord, come. And who would have thought it took, we're in the 72nd year of Israel's being a nation. And but things just keep getting more and more moving in that direction, and the fact that Israel is what changes it all. The fact that people have always looked at prophecy being fulfilled in their lifetime. That's true, but it's not till modern times that Israel's back in the land, which brings all this other stuff into focus.
You know, I appreciate you being here, Tommy, and we'll wrap it up here, but to say, you know, keep looking, keep watching, keep reading, and again, our goal here is to bring you really good, solid, biblical, historically accurate information, getting rid of some of the rumors. You know, we're not basing our belief in a pre-trib rapture or even premillennial just on what we want. We're not here to escape troubling times. We're going to get out of here. We have a lot of respect and we have a lot of love for our brothers and sisters around the world who are currently suffering.
That's right.
And it doesn't mean that Americans won't have our turn if we say that God doesn't have a special, favor towards us. He loves all of his children. But what we are doing is we're watching really the times change. We're watching things continue to accelerate. That's why we're here. We want to bring truth, and ultimately we want to bring the gospel that as we look at Scripture, truly, Jesus is the only way of salvation. If you haven't put your trust and faith in him, this is the time to do it. Things are heating up. Nobody can deny it. It's an exciting time to be a Christian. It's an exciting time to be a prophecy watcher, and it really is cool. And so, again, thank you for being here. Thank you for watching today. We continue to encourage you to look at what we're putting online, go find our magazine, find some other resources. As Jesus said, be watching and be ready because his return is soon. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.